The jet door opens, and in steps Derek Langford, a confident, sharply dressed businessman in his early 40s. Everything about him screams success. The tailored charcoal suit, the Italian leather shoes, the gleaming Rolex on his wrist. He moves with the calm authority of someone who's used to having the world bend to his will. Derek is not just wealthy, he's comfortable being wealthy, and that makes him dangerously proud. As he enters, he glances around the cabin, giving a satisfied nod. Now this, he mutters under his breath, is the kind of service I expect. He tosses his designer carry-on into a seat and adjusts his sunglasses, scanning the other passengers. To his surprise, the cabin isn't filled with the elite crowd he expected. No celebrities flashing jewelry, no CEOs talking loudly into their phones. Instead, there's only one other person aboard, sitting quietly by the window, her gaze fixed outside at the clouds beyond. She's dressed simply, light blue jeans, a gray hoodie, and white sneakers. Her hair is tied in a loose, messy bun, and there isn't a hint of makeup on her face. A steaming cup of tea rests on the table beside her, next to a small leather notebook and a pen. To Derek, she looks completely ordinary, maybe even too ordinary to belong in a place like this. He frowns slightly. "Excuse me," he says, lowering his sunglasses. "Are you sure you're on the right jet?" The woman turns her head slowly. Her eyes, a calm, clear blue, meet his for a second. There's kindness in them, but also a trace of surprise, as if she's not used to being spoken to that way. "I believe so," she says softly, her voice calm but confident. "Why do you ask?" Derek chuckles lightly, crossing his arms. "Well, no offense, but this isn't exactly a commercial flight. It's a private jet. I doubt just anyone can afford a seat here." The woman tilts her head slightly, her lips curving into a polite smile. "You're right," she says quietly. "Not just anyone can." Derek smirks, taking that as confirmation of his assumption, that she's probably a guest, or worse, a friend of someone who really owns the jet. Maybe even a lucky contest winner or an assistant tagging along. Either way, in his mind, she doesn't belong on the same level as him. "Right," he says, giving her a dismissive nod before turning to the flight attendant. "Could I get a glass of your best champagne, and make sure it's properly chilled this time?" The flight attendant, a young man in a crisp uniform, hesitates for a moment before nodding respectfully. "Of course, sir." He glances nervously toward the woman by the window before hurrying to the galley. Derek takes a seat across from her, loosening his tie slightly. He glances at her again. She's still sipping her tea quietly, flipping through pages of her notebook. The way she moves, the calmness in her demeanor, it almost irritates him. She doesn't look impressed by the luxury around her. She doesn't even seem interested. "So," Derek begins, leaning back with a smug grin, "you're flying to New York too? Business or pleasure?" She looks up briefly, considering her answer. "A little bit of both," she replies with a small smile. "Ah," he nods knowingly. "Let me guess. Influencer? You've got that low-key traveler look." She chuckles softly. "Not exactly." Derek presses on, intrigued by her simplicity. "Well, I suppose that's nice, though I'll be honest, this jet's usually reserved for pretty high-end clients. I got the call this morning. Some big record label execs wanted to meet me, so they arranged this flight. Must have cost them a fortune." "Really?" she says, raising her eyebrow, a glint of amusement flickering in her eyes. "Absolutely," Derek says, clearly enjoying his own voice. "These kinds of jets don't come cheap. Only the best for people like us, right?" She just nods politely, returning her gaze to the window. The flight attendant returns with Derek's champagne, setting it gently on the table. Derek takes a sip and sighs with satisfaction. Now this is how you travel. No crowds, no waiting, just comfort and class. But while he talks, something interesting happens. The flight attendant walks over to the quiet woman and places a folder beside her. "Miss Swift, your updated flight plan has been approved. We'll be departing in 10 minutes. Derek freezes. The name echoes in his mind. Miss Swift. He slowly turns his head toward her, eyes widening as realization dawns. The hoodie, the tea, The calm confidence, the blue eyes he's seen 1,000 times on TV and in music videos. It's her, Taylor Swift, the global icon, the woman whose name dominates charts and headlines, the same person he just dismissed as ordinary. Taylor notices his stunned expression and gives a small, knowing smile. "You were saying," she asks gently. Derek stammers, his face flushing. I didn't realize. I thought." Taylor takes another sip of tea, her tone kind but edged with quiet confidence. "That's okay," she says softly. "You weren't supposed to know." The silence that follows is thick as a knife. The engines hum to life, and as the jet begins to taxi down the runway, Derek sinks into his seat, replaying his own arrogance in his mind. The flight he thought he was taking to prove his importance just turned into the most humbling journey of his life. And this is only the beginning. The jet's engines hummed softly as the cabin filled with a faint aroma of citrus-scented air freshener. Derek lounged comfortably in his plush seat, one arm stretched across the armrest, champagne glass in hand. His confidence radiated like a spotlight. He was used to being the center of attention, the man people listened to, the one others tried to impress. But this time, something was different. The quiet woman by the window, Taylor, didn't seem impressed by him at all. She didn't even look at him after their earlier exchange. She just sat there, calm and composed, sipping her tea as if his arrogance didn't even exist. To Derek, that felt like a challenge. He adjusted his tie, leaned forward slightly, and gave her another quick scan. Plain hoodie, no jewelry, no designer bag, he thought with a smirk. She's definitely out of place here. Finally, he turned to the flight attendant, snapping his fingers lightly to get her attention. "Excuse me," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Can you tell me why she's here?" He motioned toward Taylor with a lazy wave of his hand. "This jet's for premium clients only." The young flight attendant froze. Her polite smile faltered for a moment, and her eyes darted nervously toward Taylor. She knew exactly who was sitting by the window, the owner of the aircraft herself, but Taylor's instructions were clear. No special treatment, no attention, no fuss. The attendant swallowed hard. Sir, she's..." Before she could finish, Taylor looked up calmly, offering a gentle smile that immediately put the attendant at ease. "It's all right," Taylor said softly. "I'm a passenger here too." Her voice was smooth and even, carrying an understated grace that only made Derek scoff more. "Oh, really?" he said, raising an eyebrow and chuckling under his breath. "Sweetheart, you don't look like someone who can afford a seat here. This flight isn't exactly economy class." His words sliced through the quiet cabin like a knife. The flight attendant's eyes widened, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but she stopped herself. She knew better than to interfere. Taylor had a reputation for handling herself with remarkable poise. And she didn't disappoint. Taylor didn't snap back or roll her eyes. She didn't even look offended. Instead, she simply smiled. A small, knowing smile that carried a quiet confidence far more powerful than any angry retort. "Sometimes," she said softly, stirring her tea with the tiny silver spoon, "what people look like doesn't tell you who they really are." The words hung in the air like perfume, gentle, lingering, impossible to ignore. But Derek just laughed. It wasn't a loud, hearty laugh. It was the kind of smug chuckle people give when they're certain they're right. "Yeah, sure," he said, shaking his head. "Next you'll tell me you own this jet." She looked at him for a brief moment, her eyes calm, almost amused, and then turned back to her tea. "Something like that," she said quietly. Derek blinked, unsure if she was being sarcastic or serious. "Something like that?" he repeated mockingly. "That's cute." He took another sip of his champagne and leaned back in his chair, clearly pleased with himself. He thought he'd won whatever imaginary battle he believed they were having. The flight attendant, now visibly tense, set down a small tray of snacks near Taylor and quickly retreated toward the galley. She could feel the discomfort in the air, thick, awkward, and growing heavier by the second. Taylor, however, remained completely composed. She glanced out the window again, the clouds reflecting in her eyes. It wasn't the first time someone had misjudged her. She was used to it. She'd learned long ago that fame was a mask, sometimes a blessing, sometimes a curse. And on quiet days like this, when she traveled without bodyguards, makeup, or designer clothes, she almost welcomed the anonymity. Meanwhile, Derek kept going, completely unaware of the hole he was digging for himself. "You know," he said, swirling the champagne in his glass, "people like you always amaze me. You save up for months, maybe even years, just to get a taste of this kind of life. Must be exciting for you, huh? Getting to sit here among the big players for once?" Taylor turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. There wasn't anger in her expression, only a deep, quiet understanding, like she'd heard every version of the speech before. "I think everyone's a big player in their own way. Some people just measure success differently." Derek chuckled again, missing the wisdom in her words. "That's one way to put it," he said dismissively. "But in the real world, success comes with money. And trust me, I can tell who has it and who doesn't." She smiled faintly, resting her hands on her notebook. "I'm sure you can." The flight attendant peeked from the galley, watching quietly. She'd seen this side of human nature before, people treating others based on appearances, but it never ceased to amaze her how Taylor handled it. No arrogance, no anger, just calm grace. As the jet began to taxi down the runway, Derek leaned back in his seat, crossing his legs. "Well, enjoy the ride while it lasts," he said smugly. "I doubt you'll be flying like this again anytime soon." Taylor didn't answer. She simply closed her notebook and looked out the window again. The morning light spilled across her face, catching a small glint in her eyes, one that hinted at both amusement and something deeper, something wiser. The engines roared softly as the jet lifted off the ground. For a brief moment, silence filled the cabin again. Derek smirked to himself, believing he'd made his point. He didn't realize that every arrogant word he'd spoken had just set the stage for his own humiliation. Taylor took another quiet sip of tea and whispered to herself, barely audible over the sound of the engines. People see what they want to see. And as the jet ascended higher into the clouds, it wasn't Derek's confidence that filled the air anymore. It was a quiet sense of anticipation. Because the man who thought he was surrounded by luxury had no idea he just disrespected the woman who owned it all. The engines roared gently as the sleek private jet ascended through layers of soft white clouds. The world below became a blur of blue and gold as the sun painted streaks of light across the sky. Inside, everything looked peaceful. Polished tables, velvet seats, and the muted glow of golden reading lamps casting warmth across the cabin. But the peace didn't last long. From the moment the seatbelt sign blinked off, Derek, loud, arrogant, and brimming with self-importance, was back in full performance mode. He pulled out his latest smartphone, leaned back in his seat, and started talking into it at full volume. Yeah, the deal's almost closed," he boasted, his voice echoing through the cabin. "We're talking 7 figures, maybe 8 if the board signs off. You know how it is when you're at my level." He paused, smirking at his own reflection in the polished window. Yeah, I'm flying private right now, premium jet, first class all the way. Only the best for me." A few other passengers, 2 quiet businessmen, and a middle-aged woman reading a magazine, shifted uncomfortably. The woman glanced up and then quickly back down at her page, pretending to read while silently praying for peace. But Derek was far from done. He laughed loudly, tossing in casual bragging like confetti. "You wouldn't believe some of the people on here. Some random girl, probably a social media wannabe or something, sitting like she belongs here. I mean, come on. Some people just don't fit in this kind of environment." His eyes flicked toward Taylor, who sat quietly by the window. She didn't flinch, didn't look up. She just turned a page in her notebook and kept writing, her pen gliding smoothly across the paper.
Her calmness seemed to irritate him more than any insult could. To her, his words were nothing more than static. She started humming under her breath, a barely audible tune that carried a sense of peace. It was one of those melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep within, gentle, wistful, and oddly familiar. The young flight attendant, who had already endured Derek's loudness for most of the pre-flight, quietly approached Taylor's seat and bent down slightly. "Should I say something, ma'am?" she whispered, her tone careful. Taylor looked up, smiling kindly. "No need," she said softly. "Let's just enjoy the flight." The attendant nodded and stepped back, still uneasy, but trusting Taylor's calm presence. Meanwhile, Derek was oblivious to the tension he was creating. He laughed loudly, tossing in casual bragging like confetti. "You wouldn't believe some of the people on here. Some random girl, probably a social media wannabe or something, sitting like she belongs here. I mean, come on. Some people just don't fit in this kind of environment." His eyes flicked toward Taylor, who sat quietly by the window. She didn't flinch, didn't look up. She just turned a page in her notebook and kept writing, her pen gliding smoothly across the paper. Her first words were ocean, mist, the dawn. A casual time traveler might not notice, but these words are the lyrics to a popular song, her hit single, Ocean Sky, that Derek had been unaware of during his bragging session that his own niece could be famous on social media. To her words, nothing more than static. Taylor started humming under her breath, a barely audible tune that carried a sense of peace. It was one of those melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep within, gentle, wistful, and oddly familiar. The young flight attendant, who had already endured Derek's loudness for most of the pre-flight, quietly approached Taylor's seat and bent down slightly. "Should I say something, ma'am?" she whispered, her tone careful. Taylor looked up, smiling kindly. "No need," she said softly. "Let's just enjoy the flight." The attendant nodded and stepped back, still uneasy, but trusting Taylor's calm presence. Meanwhile, Derek was oblivious to the tension he was creating. He laughed loudly, tossing in casual bragging like confetti. "You wouldn't believe some of the people on here. Some random girl, probably a social media wannabe or something, sitting like she belongs here. I mean, come on. Some people just don't fit in this kind of environment." His eyes flicked toward Taylor, who sat quietly by the window. She didn't flinch, didn't look up. She just turned a page in her notebook and kept writing, her pen gliding smoothly across the paper. Her first words were ocean, mist, and the dawn. A casual time traveler might not notice, but these words are the lyrics to a popular song, her hit single. To his words, nothing more than static. Taylor started humming under her breath, a barely audible tune that carried a sense of peace. It was one of those melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep within, gentle, wistful, and oddly familiar. The young flight attendant, who had already endured Derek's loudness for most of the pre-flight, quietly approached Taylor's seat and bent down slightly. "Should I say something, ma'am?" she whispered, her tone careful. Taylor looked up, smiling kindly. "No need," she said softly. "Let's just enjoy the flight." The attendant nodded and stepped back, still uneasy, but trusting Taylor's calm presence. Meanwhile, Derek was oblivious to the tension he was creating. He laughed loudly, tossing in casual bragging like confetti. "You wouldn't believe some of the people on here. Some random girl, probably a social media wannabe or something, sitting like she belongs here. I mean, come on. Some people just don't fit in this kind of environment." His eyes flicked toward Taylor, who sat quietly by the window. She didn't flinch, didn't look up. She just turned a page in her notebook and kept writing. Her pen glided smoothly across the paper. Her first words were ocean, mist, and the dawn. A casual time traveler might not notice, but these words are the lyrics to a popular song, her hit single, Ocean Sky, that Derek had been unaware of during his bragging session that his own niece could be famous on social media. To her words, nothing more than static. Taylor started humming under her breath, a barely audible tune that carried a sense of peace. It was one of those melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep within, gentle, wistful, and oddly familiar. The young flight attendant, who had already endured Derek's loudness for most of the pre-flight, quietly approached Taylor's seat and bent down slightly. "Should I say something, ma'am?" she whispered, her tone careful. Taylor looked up, smiling kindly. "No need," she said softly. "Let's just enjoy the flight." The attendant nodded and stepped back, still uneasy, but trusting Taylor's calm presence. Meanwhile, Derek was oblivious to the tension he was creating. He laughed loudly, tossing in casual bragging like confetti. "You wouldn't believe some of the people on here. Some random girl, probably a social media wannabe or something, sitting like she belongs here. I mean, come on. Some people just don't fit in this kind of environment." His eyes flicked toward Taylor, who sat quietly by the window. She didn't flinch, didn't look up. She just turned a page in her notebook and kept writing, her pen gliding smoothly across the paper. Her first words were ocean, mist, and the dawn. A casual time traveler might not notice, but these words are the lyrics to a popular song, her hit single, Ocean Sky, that Derek had been unaware of during his bragging session that his own niece could be famous on social media. To her words, nothing more than static. Taylor started humming under her breath, a barely audible tune that carried a sense of peace. It was one of those melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep within, gentle, wistful, and oddly familiar. The young flight attendant, who had already endured Derek's loudness for most of the pre-flight, quietly approached Taylor's seat and bent down slightly. "Should I say something, ma'am?" she whispered, her tone careful. Taylor looked up, smiling kindly. "No need," she said softly. "Let's just enjoy the flight." The attendant nodded and stepped back, still uneasy, but trusting Taylor's calm presence. Meanwhile, Derek had become oblivious to the tension he was creating. He laughed loudly, tossing in casual bragging like confetti. "You wouldn't believe some of the people on here. Some random girl, probably a social media wannabe or something, sitting like she belongs here. I mean, come on. Some people just don't fit in this kind of environment." His eyes flicked toward Taylor, who sat quietly by the window. She didn't flinch, didn't look up. She just turned a page in her notebook and kept writing, her pen gliding smoothly across the paper. Her first words were ocean, mist, and the dawn. A casual time traveler might not notice, but these words are the lyrics to a popular song, her hit single, Ocean Sky, that Derek had been unaware of during his bragging session that his own niece could be famous on social media. To her words, nothing more than static. Taylor started humming under her breath, a barely audible tune that carried a sense of peace. It was one of those melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep within, gentle, wistful, and oddly familiar. The young flight attendant, who had already endured Derek's loudness for most of the pre-flight, quietly approached Taylor's seat and bent down slightly. "Should I say something, ma'am?" she whispered, her tone careful. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin as the private jet soared smoothly above the clouds. Golden sunlight spilled through the windows, casting a warm glow over the marble tables and polished gold accents. Everything felt calm again. Derek had finally quieted down, leaning back in his seat with his champagne glass, still brimming with smug self-satisfaction. Taylor, meanwhile, was lost in her own world. She sat quietly by the window, notebook open, pen moving gracefully across the page. A few words here, a line there. The start of something new, perhaps a song. Her presence was peaceful, effortless, and yet somehow powerful. The flight had been long, but now they were approaching their destination. Outside, the faint outline of Los Angeles began to emerge through the hazy clouds. The sun was starting to dip low, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and rose gold. And then the moment came. The speakers crackled softly, and the calm voice of the captain came over the intercom. "Good afternoon, everyone. This is your captain speaking. We'll be landing shortly in Los Angeles. We hope you've enjoyed the flight, and we'd like to extend a special thanks to Miss Taylor Swift for allowing us to use her aircraft today." For a moment, there was only silence. Absolute frozen silence. Derek's hand stopped midair, his champagne glass hovering inches from his lips. His confident smirk evaporated instantly. His eyes darted toward the window, then toward the woman sitting quietly across from him. Wait, what did he just say? The middle-aged woman with the magazine looked up, eyes twinkling with amusement. One of the businessmen across the aisle grinned faintly, and the young flight attendant, who had been fighting to keep a straight face all flight, finally smiled. She leaned slightly toward Derek and said softly, "You're flying on Miss Swift's private jet, sir." Derek's mouth fell open. He turned slowly toward Taylor, who was now looking up from her notebook. She smiled warmly, lifting her hand in a small, casual wave. Surprise! For a moment, Derek could only stare. The color drained from his face. His mind raced backwards through every arrogant thing he said, every dismissive laugh, every mocking comment, every time he looked down on her. You own this jet?" he finally managed to choke out. I nodded, lightly, still calm and kind. "For a while now. It helps me get to my concerts on time." The words hit him like a thunderclap. Concerts. Taylor Swift. His brain connected the dots all at once. The calm voice, the sharp blue eyes, the quiet confidence, the way she carried herself without ever needing to prove anything. "Oh my God," Derek muttered under his breath. He looked around helplessly, his earlier arrogance replaced with sheer panic. "Miss Swift, I had no idea. Please, I didn't mean to." The cabin filled with quiet laughter. Even the crew couldn't help but smiling, though they tried to keep it professional. The other passengers exchanged amused glances. It was like watching a movie unfold right before their eyes. The arrogant man humbled by his own ignorance. Taylor, meanwhile, wasn't gloating. She didn't roll her eyes or make a sharp remark. Instead, she simply gave him a kind but firm smile. "I know," she said gently, setting her pen down. "You didn't want to know. You just judged too fast." Her voice wasn't angry. It was calm, thoughtful, and filled with meaning. The words hung in the air like a lesson meant not just for Derek, but for everyone on board. Derek swallowed hard, his mind spinning. He looked down at his champagne glass, then set it aside, embarrassed by how ridiculous he must have looked. "Miss Swift, I'm so sorry. If I had known..." Taylor interrupted softly. "That's just it, Derek. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect." He froze. The words sank deep. Taylor leaned back in her seat, her tone still gentle, but her eyes firm. "You see, people often think they can spot worth just by looking at someone, their clothes, their face, their jewelry. But that's not how value works. You can't see character or kindness from the outside." The flight attendant nodded subtly, clearly agreeing. The entire cabin seemed to hang on Taylor's words now. Even the air felt quieter. Derek ran his hand through his hair, guilt washing over him like a wave. "You're right," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have said any of that. I don't even know why I did. I guess I just assumed." Taylor smiled again, that soft, understanding smile that made her seem both human and extraordinary at once. We all assume sometimes. The difference is whether we choose to learn from it. There was no bitterness in her tone, only grace, and that made the moment hit even harder. For a long moment, no one spoke. The jet glided smoothly through the sky, descending toward Los Angeles. The glow of the sunset painted Taylor's face in soft gold. Derek sat in silence, humbled beyond words. Every ounce of arrogance had drained from him. He looked over at Taylor again, now seeing her not as a stranger, but as a reminder that appearances mean nothing compared to the person behind them. Taylor picked up her tea again and took a slow sip, smiling faintly. You know, it's funny. People think flying high makes them important, but sometimes it just shows you how small the world is. The flight attendant, standing nearby, couldn't help but smile at the line. It was so effortlessly poetic, so unmistakably Taylor Swift. Derek nodded, ashamed but grateful. I'll I'll remember that, he said quietly. I hope you do, Taylor replied, her tone still kind but her eyes firm. Because sometimes the most valuable thing you can give someone is simple: respect. The seatbelt light flicked on as the captain announced her descent. The city lights of Los Angeles sparkled below like scattered stars. As the jet dipped lower through the clouds, Derek sat back in silence, humbled and reflective. And for the first time during the entire flight, he didn't feel the need to say a single word. He just looked out the window, the golden sky fading into twilight, thinking about how easily he'd mistaken humility for insignificance, and how wrong he'd been. And Taylor? She just smiled softly to herself, humming the same quiet tune she'd been humming earlier. Because for her, this wasn't revenge. It was simply another story, one that would soon find its way into a song.
The cabin was almost silent now. The same man who had strutted aboard the jet with so much pride just hours ago now sat completely still, eyes fixed on the carpet, his once confident posture deflated. The hum of the engines filled the silence, a gentle reminder that the flight was nearing its end. Derek Langford, the self-proclaimed businessman who had spent most of the trip flaunting his wealth, now looked like a completely different person. His champagne glass sat untouched on the table beside him. The arrogance that once fueled his every word had evaporated, replaced by quiet shame. Across the aisle, Taylor Swift remained calm and graceful as she had been the entire flight. She wasn't gloating or smirking at his embarrassment. She simply continued jotting a few last lines in her notebook, occasionally glancing out the window as the city of Los Angeles grew larger beneath them, its lights sparkling like tiny stars against the dusk. Derek's thoughts swirled in his head, every word he'd said replayed on an endless loop. You don't look like someone who can afford a seat here. You remind me of those wannabe singers on TikTok. This flight isn't economy class, sweetheart. Each phrase now stabbed at his pride like a needle. He winced inwardly, wishing he could rewind time and take it all back. He had insulted Taylor Swift, one of the most successful, respected, and beloved artists on the planet, and not just insulted her, but done so with pure arrogance and ignorance. Now that he knew who she really was, the memory of his behavior felt unbearable. The flight attendant passed by quietly, collecting empty glasses. She offered Taylor a gentle smile and gave Derek a sympathetic glance, but didn't say anything. The entire crew knew what had happened. Everyone did. And though no one was laughing or whispering, the silence itself was loud enough. As the jet began its descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom once again. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly at Los Angeles International. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened. On behalf of Miss Swift and the crew, thank you for flying with us. Derek closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. When the jet touched down, the smooth landing felt like the end of a storm. The engines powered down, the cabin lights brightened, and the seatbelt fines went off with a soft ding. Taylor stood first, gracefully gathering her things. She slid her notebook into her bag, adjusted her hoodie, and turned to face Derek. Her expression wasn't cold or smirking at his embarrassment. She simply continued jotting a few last lines in her notebook, occasionally glancing out the window as the city of Los Angeles grew larger beneath them, its lights sparkling like tiny stars against the dusk. Derek's thoughts swirled in his head, every word he'd said replayed on an endless loop. You don't look like someone who can afford a seat here. You remind me of those wannabe singers on TikTok. This flight isn't economy class, sweetheart. Each phrase now stabbed at his pride like a needle. He winced inwardly, wishing he could rewind time and take it all back. He had insulted Taylor Swift,
one of the most successful, respected, and beloved artists on the planet, and not just insulted her, but done so with pure arrogance and ignorance. Now that he knew who she really was, the memory of his behavior felt unbearable. Taylor Swift remained calm and graceful, as she had been the entire flight. She wasn't gloating or smirking at his embarrassment. She simply continued jotting a few last lines in her notebook, occasionally glancing out the window as the city of Los Angeles grew larger beneath them, its lights sparkling like tiny stars against the dusk. Derek's thoughts swirled in his head, every word he'd said replayed on an endless loop. "You don't look like someone who can afford a seat here. You remind me of those wannabe singers on TikTok. This flight isn't economy class, sweetheart." Derek closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. When the jet touched down, the smooth landing felt like the end of a storm. The engines powered down, the cabin lights brightened, and the seatbelt signs went off with a soft ding. Taylor stood first, gracefully gathering her things. She slid her notebook into her bag, adjusted her hoodie, and turned to face Derek. Her expression wasn't cold or smirking at his embarrassment. She simply continued jotting a few last lines in her notebook, occasionally glancing out the window as the city of Los Angeles grew larger beneath them. "You know," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. "You never really know who someone is, just by how they look." Derek lifted his head, meeting her gaze for the first time since the announcement. There was no anger in her tone, no judgment, just quiet truth. Taylor continued, "Kindness doesn't cost a thing, but arrogance can cost you respect." The words hit him like a gentle but powerful wave. He swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice stripped of all ego. "Miss Swift, I'm truly sorry. I was so busy trying to look important that I forgot to be decent. You didn't deserve that." Taylor smiled, her eyes softening. "Apology accepted." She paused, letting the moment linger before adding, "Just remember next time, treat everyone like they're already somebody, because they are." The simplicity of the words struck deeper than any lecture could have. There was no condescension in her tone, only warmth, the kind of compassion that came from experience. For a long moment, Derek sat in silence, unsure how to respond. All he could do was nod. Taylor slung her small leather bag over her shoulder and turned toward the cabin door. Through the window, Derek could see a sleek black limousine waiting on the tarmac, surrounded by a discreet but visible security team. The golden California sunset framed the scene perfectly, a surreal moment that looked like it had been pulled straight from a movie. As she reached the exit, the flight attendants lined up to thank her politely. Taylor exchanged warm smiles with each of them, her down-to-earth demeanor unchanged despite her fame. Before stepping off, she turned once more to look at Derek. She said, "Have a good evening," she said gently, "and don't be too hard on yourself. Just do better next time." Her words weren't sharp, they were hopeful. And then she was gone. The door closed softly behind her. Derek remained seated for a moment, staring at the empty spot where she'd been. Through the small oval window, he watched as Taylor's security team opened the limousine door for her. She waved once at the crew before stepping inside. Her figure bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Derek felt a strange mix of awe and regret swirl inside him. He had spent the entire flight trying to act like someone important, and in doing so he had completely missed what real importance looked like. Not money, not luxury, not fame, but humility, grace, kindness. He thought about her words again. Treat everyone like they're already somebody, because they are. It was such a simple idea, yet it felt like a revelation. The flight attendant approached, smiling gently. "Was the SUF flight, sir?" she asked softly. Derek chuckled, shaking his head. "No," he said. "Actually, it probably was the most important one I've ever taken." She nodded, understanding perfectly, and continued down the aisle. As Derek stood to collect his things, he glanced at the now empty seat by the window, the seat where Taylor Swift had sat quietly, sipping tea and teaching him one of the most valuable lessons of his life. He sighed deeply, buttoned his suit jacket, and stepped off the jet, no longer as the arrogant man who thought he owned the world, but as someone who had just learned what true class really looks like. Because sometimes, the richest people aren't the loudest in the room. They're the ones who don't need to say a word.
That night, as Los Angeles glittered under the moonlight, Derek Langford sat alone in his penthouse apartment, staring at the city skyline. The same skyline that once made him feel powerful now seemed distant, almost indifferent. He hadn't stopped thinking about what happened on that jet. Every word,
every smirk, every foolish assumption replaying in his mind like a movie he couldn't pause. On the table in front of him sat his phone. The screen was still open to Taylor Swift's profile. Tens of millions of followers, countless achievements, and a reputation built not only on talent, but also on grace and humility. He remembered her calm smile, her gentle tone, the way she hadn't once tried to humiliate him, even though she easily could have. She had every right to expose him, to call him out in front of everyone, but she didn't. Instead, she taught him something far greater than embarrassment could ever achieve: the power of kindness. After hours of restless thinking, Derek finally opened his social media app and began typing. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long moment before the words began to flow. Honest, raw, and straight from the heart. Today I learned a lesson I'll never forget. I judged a woman on a jet by how she looked, only to find out she owned it. That woman was Taylor Swift. To anyone reading this, humility is wealth. Never look down on anyone. He read it again and again before hitting post. There was no fancy caption, no filter, no hashtags, just truth. Within minutes, the post started gaining traction. At first, a few friends commented things like, "Wait, are you serious?" And, "Dude, what even happened?" But then, someone screenshotted the post and shared it on X, formerly Twitter. Within an hour, it exploded. By midnight, Derek's name was trending alongside Taylor Swift's. The story, "Man insults Taylor Swift on her own jet, instantly regrets it," spread across social media like wildfire. Every major entertainment page reposted it. Headlines began popping up. Taylor Swift teaches a fan a powerful lesson on kindness at 30,000 feet. How Taylor Swift turned an awkward moment into a masterclass in grace. The internet applauds Taylor for handling arrogance with style. The comment sections overflowed with admiration for Taylor and, surprisingly, even respect for Derek for owning up to his mistake. One user wrote, "This is why she's Taylor Swift. Not just because of her music, but because she handles everything with class." Another added, "He got humbled in first class. And honestly, good for him. At least he learned from the best." Someone else simply said, "Classic Taylor, classy as ever." Fan pages began posting clips from her concerts, captions reading, "Kindness is power. Be like Taylor." Memes surfaced of Derek's quote, "Humility is wealth," written over images of Taylor performing on stage, smiling under the bright lights. By morning, Derek's phone was blowing up with notifications. Journalists reached out asking for interviews. Influencers were tagging him in videos, and strangers from around the world were leaving messages like, "Thank you for being honest enough to admit your mistake. That took courage, man." We all need this reminder sometimes. But the most humbling part, Taylor Swift didn't say a single word about it. She didn't repost it. She didn't like or comment. She didn't make a statement through her team. She didn't have to. Her silence was louder than any public response could have been. It carried the same quiet strength she'd shown on that jet, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything. And somehow, that silence made the story even more powerful. Over the next few days, articles continued to circulate, and talk shows mentioned it as a feel-good viral moment. People discussed how rare it was for someone as famous as Taylor to respond to disrespect with such calm understanding. No anger, no drama, just poise. Even Derek's close friends called to say they were proud of how he handled it afterwards. One of them joked, "You messed up big time, bro, but at least you learned from the best." He laughed, though there was still a quiet humility in his voice. "Yeah," he said, "and I don't plan on forgetting it." For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to brag, to show off, or to act superior. The likes and views didn't excite him anymore. They just reminded him of how empty arrogance could be. He began noticing small things he'd once ignored. Holding doors open for strangers, thanking service staff, offering his seat to older passengers at the airport. It wasn't for show. It was genuine. Because every time he felt his old ego creeping back, he remembered that look in Taylor's eyes. Calm, confident, and compassionate. Weeks later, as the story slowly faded from the trending pages, Derek found himself at peace. The experience had changed something inside him. He wasn't the same man who'd walked onto that jet, smirking and dismissive. He was someone who understood that real success wasn't measured in money or luxury, but in how you make others feel. And even though Taylor never spoke about the incident publicly, her quiet grace had done what her music often did, inspired millions without needing explanation. One evening, as Derek scrolled through the final waves of reactions online, he stumbled upon a fan comment that made him smile. Taylor didn't just own the jet that day, she owned the moment. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. Yeah, he thought, she really did. Before setting his phone down, he wrote one last private note in his journal, a new habit he'd picked up after seeing Taylor writing during the flight. Never judge, always listen, lead with kindness, because sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the one flying the plane. And with that, Derek closed his notebook, leaned back in his chair, and looked out over the city lights, feeling lighter, humbler, and infinitely wiser than he had the day before. Because one flight with Taylor Swift taught him more about life than all his million-dollar deals ever could.